National Assembly Speaker Nosiviwe Nqakula says they're ready to host peace talks with the parliaments of Ukraine and Russia. This comes as the ongoing conflict between the two countries continues. Just last week, President Ramaphosa led what some people consider a controversial African peace mission to Ukraine and Russia, which received criticism from various opposition parties and other entities. So will the latest move by the South African government perhaps further fuel this debate? Let's get your reaction from the good party. It's MP Brett Herron joins us now via our video link. And Brett, it's great to have you on the program as always. Thanks for making time. I wonder just how much support this particular leg of these peace talks actually enjoys in the National Assembly, do you think?
Well, Ayanda, good morning. Good has always from the very beginning said that South Africa's foreign policy is to remain unaligned. There is historic precedent for both the current President Ramaphosa, who joined Nelson Mandela, our first democratic president, in helping resolve the conflict in Northern Ireland through mediating between the parties. So we encouraged President Ramaphosa to learn from his past experience and the precedent set by former President Mandela and attempt mediation if we're going to remain unaligned, because we have unique experience of mediating conflict, and our position as an unaligned sovereign nation allowed us to do that. So the attempt last week by the president was not something that we're critical of, although the logistics and the planning and the extent to which the efforts were welcomed by Russia in particular are obviously questionable. But the latest development is the Speaker and the delegation at the Interparliamentary Union gathering agreeing to host or proposing to host the parliaments of Ukraine and Russia in dialogue. So we must remember the Speaker presides over the legislature, which is not the government, it's not the executive. So my only concern, although I support dialogue, is that there now would be a parallel process between what the government is doing and what those of us who are serving the National Assembly would be doing.
Yeah, that's one of the concerns. The other is that we know that Parliament isn't a homogenous group of people. There are different ideological leanings, and in fact, those ideologies place culpability on different parties. Should we be worried about coherence even as we enter those talks, if in fact it does get there?
I wouldn't be worried about coherence because, as you correctly say, within the National Assembly there are parties who align themselves with either side of this war. If we're going to engage with Ukraine and Russia as parliamentarians, those viewpoints would probably help us make progress, because there would be the opportunity to challenge views that have been developed without first-hand experience. So the fact that different parties have different views, I think, could add to the texture and to the progress that such an engagement could make. That's not my worry. My worry really is, my concern would be what the status of a parliamentarian engagement would be when the government has adopted a non-aligned position, but by many appearances appears to be slightly aligned or aligned to one of the parties, Russia. Certainly that's a perception that exists, I think, in other parts of the world, and even within the House. So really what would be the status of a parliament engaging with Ukraine's parliament and Russia's parliament around ending the war when the government has a different agenda?
Right, all right. I hear you, but help me square this in my head, Brett. You don't reckon it's important for the House to have a unified voice as we approach these talks? In my head, that leaves an opportunity for us to have egg on our faces in a context where, ironically, you might find our own parliamentarians engaged in debate about what the way forward ought to look like in front of their counterparts in Ukraine and Russia.
Look, I mean, I don't think it's possible to have a coherent or one voice, because, as you say, parties, I mean, there are 14 political parties represented in the National Assembly, and South Africa's diversity is reflected in our National Assembly by virtue of our proportional representation system. And so, if the stumbling block is going to be that we need to engage with Ukraine and Russia with one voice, then there's no point in engaging, because that's not going to be possible.
Yeah.
So I'm looking to say, let's take the different voices into those engagements, and let those voices and those who dissent or have different views have their views challenged by those people who live with the war. So I don't see the lack of coherence as a stumbling block. I'm more interested in the resolution that was adopted by the IPU, International Parliamentary Union, which is where this comes from, which was a condemnation of Russia's occupation of a sovereign state, Ukraine, which is much further. It's a resolution that's much stronger and much further down the line than our own government's position. So our speaker and our delegation from the House participated in the adoption of that resolution.
So, in other words, there's concerns around the kind of tone, perhaps, that was set by the president versus the tone that be set by this interparliamentary discussion, as it were.
Yeah, I think the president is trying to maintain the non-aligned status.
Yeah.
And despite the perceptions and the accusation that we supported Russia by loading weapons on a ship in Simonstown, I think the president has tried to maintain that non-aligned status or perception of being non-aligned. On the other hand, the speaker and the delegation to the IPU adopted a resolution that condemned Ukraine's invasion and occupation, Russia's invasion and occupation of Ukraine, and called for it an end, which is much further than our national executive or our government has gone. So it's interesting that there could be discussions or dialogue between the South African parliamentarians, despite their various views, under the banner of this resolution, while parallel to this process we have a non-aligned government apparently attempting to mediate between the parties.
I'm with you. So I suppose the overarching question is, what is South Africa's stance really? Because on the one hand, as you mentioned, the president trying to tread this very fine line, while this IPU has certainly gone a step further. So with that in mind, I mean, I certainly agree with you. There's a bit of a discrepancy there. Is it wise for us to be part of these discussions?
Well, I mean, as I said right in the beginning, we were advocates for dialogue and for mediation, and I don't have a lot of confidence that this dialogue between parliamentarians will impact on the war. But if you withhold yourself from dialogue, then there's absolutely no possibility of any positive outcome. So I would encourage that we participate and hope. And I guess hope is not really a plan or a strategy, but it's a hope that maybe there is something that can be achieved, if nothing else other than to perhaps push our own government to take a much firmer stance on this.
Yeah. I wonder what you make of the engagements that were led by the president, though. I mean, there's been such a mixed reaction, that's the cliche we used in the media, around how the president engaged with his counterparts in Ukraine and Russia. In many instances, those who view this trip from the perspective of the journalists who are stuck in Poland are calling it an absolute disaster. Government yesterday, through the minister in the presidency, at pains, though, to explain that it actually wasn't a waste and there was something to it. How do you see it?
Yeah, look, when the news broke that the contingent of the delegates, which included the presidential security team and journalists, were stuck in Warsaw, and the president was continuing with his trip, that debacle is unfortunate, and where the blame lies for that, is again a matter of conflict between two countries. Poland saying South Africa didn't have its paperwork in order, and South Africa saying Poland was basically sabotaging us. But the actual dialogue between the two presidents, Russian and Ukrainian, and the African mission, clearly didn't achieve much. But I mean, anyone who expected that this delegation would go there and come back with a resolution, I think, would be delusional. So this must be part of a process. The first attempt at dialogue. I would hope, now I didn't follow the briefing yesterday, that there would be follow-up dialogue with both parties, both sides, because anyone who had an expectation that one trip could resolve a war that's been on for 9 years, I think would be wrong.
Yeah.
So despite the chaos and the apparent lack of progress, if the president and the mission attempts again and again and again to engage, I think that we can chip away at this conflict and hopefully make some progress. So I would encourage the president to continue trying.
Sure. And Brett, I wouldn't be forgiven if I don't ask this question from you, or of you. Yesterday, the Chief Justice had choice words for the role that Parliament played in the lead-up to so-called now state capture, as we understand it. Interesting to find how Parliament has responded to that, though, through Moloto Mothapo, saying it's inappropriate for the Chief Justice to be engaging in what Moloto Mothapo describes as public attacks. Do you agree with that?
It's unusual for the Chief Justice to be, there are three branches of government, the judiciary, the legislature, and the executive, and we are all there to keep each other in check. So it's unusual for the Chief Justice to be as direct and in his attacks on Parliament as he was. But the three branches of government are there to keep each other in check. So if Parliament is failing, and it's not remarks that were only made yesterday, it's also the findings of his commission report that Parliament didn't do enough. Then we must reflect on how Parliament can do better in holding the executive to account, so that prosecutions can take place arising out of the Zondo Commission's report, and that state capture can be mitigated or eliminated. And so parliamentarians must take it on the chin. We failed, and we failed to hold the executive to account adequately, and we must do better in doing so in future. But right now, our focus, I think, must be on the failure of the prosecutions that follow from the Zondo Commission, because the findings of the Zondo Commission have been part of South Africa's dialogue for the past 5 years. The Zondo Commission just confirmed what was already largely in the public domain, and the prosecuting authority and Hawks must get their act together, and we need to see some prosecutions.
Loud and clear. Brett Herron, MP with the Good Party, as always. It's great chatting to you. Thanks very much indeed for your time.